Hi, how's it going? Bob DeBoo here for Open Studio. Thanks for watching. Hope you're doing well. Today we're going to talk about a really important concept, and that has to do with turnarounds. We're going to talk about why we use turnarounds, where are they located, how does a turnaround work, when does it happen, and what we can do to these turnarounds to make them a little bit more interesting sometimes. So this is by no means a complete breakdown on all the possibilities of turnarounds, but we are going to get into some interesting ones, starting off basic and then building into some more advanced concepts. So we're going to break this video down into describing more about what a turnaround is, why we're going to use it, of course, the basic idea behind it. Then we're going to get into some more advanced concepts like secondary dominance and tritone substitution. So feel free to, if you already got the basic idea of what a turnaround is, feel free to scroll ahead and check out what we're going to talk about with secondary dominance, tritone substitutions. We're also going to dig into some real world examples of some other type of turnarounds, like checking out Lady Bird, checking out Joe Henderson's Isotope, Monk's Bench of Swing, some really cool stuff in there too. But let's just get into it really quick with why we use turnarounds. Turnarounds typically happen at the end of forms to bring us back to the top of a form that we're playing over. A, B, A. The two bars towards the very end of that, at the very end of that, we're going to put a turnaround in there to help us cycle back to the top of the form. So everything seems cyclical, right? And it keeps going back and forth. Another really common place to put in a turnaround would be the last two bars of that first A section to bring us back to the second A section. Okay, we don't typically do a turnaround in the second A section because that's typically leading us to the bridge. All right, so it's just some basic form knowledge there about where we're going to put turnarounds, and they're not always written in. So the point of this video today too is to just promote turnaround awareness, so we know a bunch of different options that we can use. So if we're on the bandstand, we can either say them, impose them, or if we're hearing them back, then we can respond appropriately. So a turnaround, basically in a major key, a turnaround typically is going to start with a 1 chord and end with a 5 chord. And that 5 chord is going to get us back to the 1 chord at the top of, say, the form, or back to the second A section, as I was mentioning earlier. So stick with me. We're going to get into it now. Let's get into our first concept of a turnaround. Here we go. So there's a 1 chord. Here's a 5 chord. I'm going to add some bass to this. That's the 5 chord, right? So here's 1, like we've landed in our home key. Here's a 5 key to get us back to the home key at the top of the form. This could also be vamped. All these turnarounds can be looped, just like what we're hearing right now, right? Okay, so cool. That's a very common and simplistic turnaround, just to put that 5 chord in there. So that's our first turnaround. So the next example of what we can do with this turnaround to get away from just the 1 to the 5 is to put a 2 chord in front of that 5 chord in the second measure. And it would sound like this. That's a 1, 2, 5. 1, that's C major, D minor 7 to G7. And that helps us to get a little bit more information in that second bar. We're just going to cycle back to the top again, right? So this is our second turnaround. We got 1, 2, 5, 1. And that's a really common way to deal with turnarounds too. That's probably 99% of what you need to know to play the most common standards that we're going to deal with. So to push that concept a little bit further, so we've built upon the 1 to the 5 chord, and now we've done 1 to 2, 5. And the 2, 5 is a very, very common concept inside of jazz music, right? To help extend the sound of the 5 chord. Well, oftentimes what happens, and you'll hear this in, say, a composition like I Got Rhythm, you'll hear it 1, 6, 2, 5. And if we keep everything diatonic, it's going to sound like this. All right? 6, 2, 5. So this is C major to A minor 7, D minor 7 to G7, right? So everything inside of this can kind of be reduced down to C major. Okay, so that's our next step in the evolution of our turnaround, 1, 6, 2, 5. Let's take it to the next level now. Okay, so it's very important to know that we oftentimes use substitutions in jazz progressions, right? It can happen almost at any point, but especially in turnarounds. And that's going to be the crux of what we talk about and explore today. So the very first and most important one that we, especially as bass players, pianists, guitar players, need to understand is that the 1 chord can often be substituted with the 3 chord. Okay, so if we're in the key of C, the 3rd note of the C major scale would be E, and if we keep that diatonic, it would be a minor chord. So that gives us 3, 6, 2, 5, which is another way to say 1, 6, 2, 5, except we're changing the root. And as bass players, a lot of times that's up to us. So here's an example of what 3, 6, 2, 5 sounds like. 3, 6, 2, 5, 3, 6. So this is especially effective when we're vamping, right? Because it doesn't sound like we've gone back to the one at the top of these 2 bars. Okay, so that's just a variation changing out the 1 chord for a different chord. Cool, right? Earlier in the video, I mentioned something about secondary dominants. Let's talk about what a secondary dominant is, why we want to use it, and yeah, so first up, why? Secondary dominants change the sound of the chord progression, and it's almost like we're changing keys really quick. The secondary dominant, just to back up even further, a dominant is like our 5 chord. In this case, we're doing everything in C, so G7 is our 5 chord to get back to the 1 chord of C, right? So say, what if we wanted to emphasize the 2 chord, say D minor 7 here. If we put a 5 in front of that, that would be A7. So we'd call that a secondary dominant. It's basically like you're putting a dominant in there, kind of forcing the issue to draw attention to the next chord that's coming up, but it makes your ears perk up if you're not used to hearing that, right? So let's check this out now. We're going to take our 1, 6, 2, 5 pattern. We're going to keep the same roots, but the harmony is going to change. 6, 2, 5. So here's also probably this is the most common way that jazz musicians will play a 1, 6, 2, 5 without extensions or alterations. So just keeping everything really simplistic. A7 leading to D minor 7. So it sounds different, right? Cool. Excellent. So that is how we can change a 1, 6, 2, 5 around just by changing a chord quality. So to further elaborate on that, let's check out changing chord qualities even more. So we've got our secondary dominant of A7. And we're going to alter that now. Let's add in a flat 9 and let's add in a flat 13. What this is doing is we're thinking of the 5 chord leading to a new minor key, right? We've set up our secondary dominant of A7 to sound like we're kind of temporarily changing keys into D minor. So if we do that, we're going to play an A7 with this flat 9. And typically you play a scale like this with a flat 13 with an F natural in it. It's basically, for all intents and purposes, it's D harmonic minor, or you could think the 5th mode of D harmonic minor, which would start on an A. So we'd have A, B flat, C sharp, D natural, E natural, F, G, and A. Okay? So we can play that scale over the A7, flat 9, flat 13. Let's also put another alteration in at the 5 chord. Everything so far has just been straight up G7, but if we add in a flat 9 to that chord, it can help to add some interest to this turnaround. Just listen first. It's got a different vibe to it. Right there, you hear that flat 9? I'm gonna add some roots. So it's got a different thing to it. This sounds different too, right? So if I play over this a little bit, right? So it adds a little bit of harmonic interest, and everything we're talking about is harmonically either adding or taking away tension right now. So very important concept to think about adding in some alterations to our dominant chords, okay? So let's now take this secondary dominant concept to another level. So we've been dealing with a D minor 7 or our minor 2 chord, but you can just as easily turn this minor 2 chord into a dominant chord as well. It adds another level of interest. We're getting more and more outside of the key of C major, but it still sounds good and it very commonly gets used. So we want to have this in our bag too and be able to hear this. This is what it sounds like. There's our A. there's a D7 in there. You hear that major, C major, A7, D7, G7. It sounds like this. So basically at this point, from a bass player's point of view, nothing has really changed. It's just the harmony that's happening above our root notes, right? But further down the road, we're going to talk about doing some substitutions, specifically tritone substitutions, which can be very effective to be used in turnarounds. Okay, now back to secondary dominants. All right, so we talked about adding in an A7, changing the A minor 7 to A7. The D minor 7 is now D7, and our G7 has stayed the same. Five chords are always going to be dominant chords of some type, by the way. What about the one chord? Okay, remember earlier we changed the one chord from C to E minor? Well, you can change that E minor as well to an E7 and make it a secondary dominant of the A7. It's a different type of alteration, right? But it sounds like this. We have to be careful with this, especially if we're playing underneath the melody, because if the melody doesn't include the sound that we're about to deal with, then it could clash for sure. So we want to use our ears and be respectful of what's happening in the music. And that goes for any of these turnarounds, by the way. This is especially effective as a vamp. So here's E7 to A7, D7. D7, F7. So it kind of takes you by surprise because you're so used to hearing the 1, 6, 2, 5, and especially diatonically, right? Cool, it's different, right? At this point, we're going to start moving more into tritone substitution territory, which is definitely a crucial concept when we're talking about turnarounds. First up, let's talk about a tritone, what a tritone is. So say if we're in the key of C, a tritone would be either, you could think about it as a sharp 4 or a flat 5 away from whatever note you're playing at the moment, okay? So if I'm in C, the 5 would be G, now lower that by a half step and you get G flat. So that would be a tritone, going from C to G flat. You could also conversely think about it this way, going from C to F and raising that F up a half step. We're thinking sharp 11. So C to F sharp, it still sounds a tritone, right? So that's a really important concept when you're thinking about tritones too, what it inharmonically works out to be. Here it is. So if we're thinking D minor 7, if I thought the third, I'll put the third up here, which is F. So I'm thinking D with an F on top and a 7th, which would be C. And I want to lead that into G7, so I'll play a G. The F stays the same on top, that's the 7th of G7. But now that's the 7th of G7, but the C is now lowered down to G, or B natural for the G7 chord. So it sounds like that, right? So what we're going to do with the tritone is change that G7 into a D flat, because here's G flat. A flatted fifth away would be D flat. But the thirds and the sevenths stay the same. It's crucial to know. So a D flat 7, the third of D flat 7 would be F as well. The dominant 7th of D flat 7 would be a B. So we're going from something like this, D minor 7, to G7. And it typically would go to 1, right? All right, cool. So D minor 7, to D flat 7 now. And it works that way too. Cool, right? So let's tritone sub the 3 chord that we just made a dominant a minute ago. So we're doing E7, A7, D7, G7. Let's tritone sub out that first E7 and see what that sounds like. So we've got a different root movement now. Here we go. It's unexpected, right? That's kind of the point of you doing these tritone substitutions, just to add a little bit more life into what's happening, right? Right, so that's a fun one to do. You can, instead of, and we're not playing the 1 chord anymore, we've tritone subbed out the 3 chord, and it becomes a B flat. So it adds an interesting element of different root progression coming from the bass. Okay, cool. So we've tritone subbed out the 3 chord, the E7, to go to a B flat, and we've gone from B flat 7 to A7. Next up, we played a D7. Let's tritone out that sucker now. So what would be a tritone of D7? Flat 5 is A flat. So what the root movement we're going to do now is B flat, A flat, G, and still that 5 chord is going to get us back to 1. That's the idea here, right? So let's listen to that now. So here's B flat 7, A7, A flat 7, G7. So it's a slight variation. It's still a variation of that 1-6-2-5, but it's just slowly starting to deviate further and further from where we began with these tritone substitutions. And remember, this is all coming out of the secondary dominant type of concept too, right? All right, still with me? Everything good? All right, let's talk about how these secondary dominants and tritone substitutions get put into some real life situations. First up, we're going to look at what is commonly referred to as either the Tad Dameron turnaround or Ladybird turnaround. And it happens like this, and you'll notice that we're dealing with some tritone substitutions, right? Remember, our 1-6-2-5 is like this: 1, 6, or A, 7, D7 perhaps, or D minor 7, G is the 5 chord again, right? Great. So the root progression is what is characteristic of the Ladybird turnaround, and it has to deal with this. It's 1, flat 3, which is a tritone of the 6, right? That's important to know. Then it goes to the flat 6, which is a tritone of the 2 chord. Cool? And then it goes to the flat 2, which we've not talked about yet, but that is a tritone of the 5 chord. Remember, we talked about G. The tritone of that would be D flat. So that D flat 7, it shares the same thirds and sevenths, you remember, and it will lead us back into C. So we'll have C, E flat, A flat, D flat, and back to C. And we can vary it inside of that too. But let's listen to this first. So the 1 chord is major. This is a dominant chord right now. This is a dominant chord and a dominant chord. So C, E flat 7, A flat 7, D flat 7. Cool? So major, dominant, dominant, dominant. Now I keep repeating that because it's important to note that the Ladybird turnaround gets changed up a lot too. So a really common variation on that is to, instead of making those dominant chords, is to make those all major 7th chords. It just has this really nice lift. So let's check that out now. So we've got the same root movement. I'll play the roots. But you can tell there's major 7ths in there now, right? So it adds some spice to it again. And again, this is still all based around the old school 1-6-2-5 turnaround. We're just changing it up. All right, let's jump years ahead now into kind of perhaps where Coltrane got his Coltrane changes from, what's commonly referred to nowadays as Coltrane changes. But this is the idea of moving around in certain major third descending type of things. We've got other videos on this. You can find a bunch about this. But it's basically, we're going to change the qualities of this Ladybird turnaround, and it's going to sound slightly different. So we're going to play the 1 chord in C, and again, you can always change this out with the 3 chord and other variations of that dominant 7th, B flat 7 as well. We're going from C to E flat 7, okay? So just like what we were doing with the initial one. But now we're going to go to A flat major, like we've resolved into A flat major, which is a very important concept. That E flat 7, that's a 5, trying to lead into A flat major 7, right? So that makes sense? Cool. Now the A flat 7, we're going to move that into D flat 7, and that's back to our tritone sub of the G7, leading us back to the 1. So let's listen to what that sounds like now. It's still C to E flat, it's still to A flat, it's still to D flat. Do you hear the difference in the qualities of the chords? It's a dominant chord, it's a major 7, dominant 7. Dominant, major 7, dominant. That's a key characteristic of the difference in these three versions of the Ladybird turnaround. Let's check out some more variations on these turnarounds that are still all built around the 1-6-2-5, but are slightly different. The first one that we're going to talk about is the chord changes to Thelonious Monk's Bemsha Swing. It sounds like a 1-6-2-5 with a bunch of variations in it, and it's basically that. So some characteristics of this, though, is that there's some alterations in the 1-6-2-5, both the root movement and the chord qualities. So let's listen to it first. Just listen first. Still in C. But check out the different root movement. It's just cyclical, right? So here's 1-6, flat 6, 2, flat 2, excuse me, 1, flat 3, regular 2, dominant, flat 2, 1, 6, flat 6, 2, and those are all dominants with some different alterations in them. Sometimes, but it works out really well. So major, dominant, and it goes to a bridge, which is up a fourth, and it uses the same type of information. But that is all basically still 1-6-2-5 with some of those tritone substitutions. We've got literally 1, 6, but it's dominant, like that secondary dominant, with an alteration in it, that sharp 11. Then we're going to A flat 7, which is a tritone sub of the 2 chord, right, or D. D flat 7, which is a tritone sub of the 5 chord. Back to 1, no explanation needed, right? E flat is a tritone of that dominant 6 chord. 2 as a dominant instead of a minor chord. D flat 7 as a tritone substitution, which always has to be a dominant chord of some type, leading back to the 1 again. Let's check out another one. We're going to check out just the turnaround at the end of Joe Henderson's Isotope, which is a very interesting tune. It's a blues, but it goes in a bunch of unexpected places. And this is the last 2 bars of Joe Henderson's Isotope. Let's just check out the root movement first. It's 1-6, all right? No big changes there, right? But then it goes to a G flat in the root. Unexpected, like the tritone of the key that we're in. 1-6, which is also down a minor third, right? It's just descending down minor thirds. So if we put it like, say, up here, A7 to G flat 7 to E flat 7, and if we did yet another minor third descending, it would lead us back to the 1 chord. So super clever, right? 1, minor third down, minor third down, minor third down. So he's just using dominant chords, moving in a separate way, but it's still cyclical and counts as a turnaround like that, right? Super interesting. Let's listen to it and play along with it now. Do, C, down a minor third to A, down a minor third to G flat, to E flat 7. It's interesting, right? Now this one you don't commonly, I don't commonly hear that turnaround get substituted in for a typical turnaround substitution. All right, so that's a basic breakdown of turnarounds. What I'm calling a turnaround breakdown. There's a bunch of different ways that you can do this. We've by no means exhausted our conversation about it, but hopefully this video gets you on the path of thinking in some more creative ways. And when you see turnarounds that don't look familiar, or maybe you haven't recognized them as turnarounds, then they'll make sense and you'll understand where it's coming from. Again, the basic structure, right, is either 2 bars, 4 bars at the end of an A section leading back to the second A, or at the end of an A section at the very end of a form leading back to the top of the form. And this can also happen in various places too. They can be used as vamps. They can be repeated over and over and over. They don't always go back to the 1 chord. and maybe we'll talk about that in another video. But hope you enjoyed this. Hopefully it was entertaining. It was fun to make. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions, any suggestions, anything at all for upcoming videos, and happy practicing. Take care.